The fluorescent lights of the third floor at Baptist Medical Center in San Antonio buzzed with that particular hum that only existed after midnight, a sound somewhere between a whisper and a warning. At 2:14 in the morning, the hallways held the kind of stillness that made footsteps sound like confessions. The air smelled of antiseptic and old coffee and something else underneath it all, something harder to name. The accumulated weight of 10,000 prayers spoken in low voices against white walls. George Strait walked slowly, one hand trailing the cool surface of the corridor wall, his boots making soft sounds against the linoleum floor. He wore no hat. That had been deliberate. In a place like this, at an hour like this, he had no interest in being recognized. He was 63 years old and had spent the better part of 4 decades being recognized everywhere he went. And tonight, of all nights, he wanted to be nobody in particular. Just a man in jeans and a plain gray shirt, walking a hospital corridor at 2 in the morning because he couldn't sleep. And the walls of his private room felt like they were leaning in. The cardiologist, a precise, unhurried man named Dr. Richard Holloway, had told him it was likely stress-related. Likely. That word had sat in George's chest like a splinter all evening. Not definitely. Not certainly. Likely. He had a concert in Austin in 4 days, and before that, a meeting in Nashville about a new recording contract. And before that, a dozen other obligations stacked like hay bales in August heat. The tour had been relentless. His band, his crew, his management, everyone was counting on him. And his heart, apparently, had decided to register a formal complaint. He paused near a window at the end of the corridor. Below, San Antonio glittered in the February cold, the river walk lights reflecting in the dark water, the city going on with its indifferent, beautiful life. He pressed 2 fingers lightly against his chest, as if checking whether the splinter was still there. It was. You checking on the city, or hoping it'll check on you? The voice came from his left. And it was the kind of voice that didn't startle you. It arrived with a natural gravity, like the first low note of a cello. George turned. The man standing a few feet away was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a simple dark sweater and khaki pants, a worn paperback tucked under one arm. His face was one of the most recognizable faces in the world, and yet here, in the blue-white glow of the hospital corridor, it carried none of the weight of fame. It carried only age and kindness and a particular quality of attention that made you feel immediately that you had his full focus. Morgan Freeman looked at him with calm, unhurried eyes. George let out a short breath that was almost a laugh. "I'll be honest," he said. "I was not expecting company." "Neither was I." Morgan glanced down at the book under his arm, a collection of short stories by Flannery O'Connor, George noticed. "I was heading back from room 318. A man named Walter Kowalski, 81 years old, stage 4 pancreatic cancer. He likes O'Connor. We've been working our way through her stories for the last 3 weeks." He said it simply, without drama, the way a person describes a habit they've had so long it no longer requires explanation. George looked at him for a moment. "You come here regularly?" "Every Tuesday and Thursday night. Sometimes Saturdays." Morgan moved to stand beside him at the window. "I've been doing it for about 6 years. Different hospitals, different cities, wherever I happen to be." He paused. "It started after a friend of mine died alone in a hospital in Los Angeles. Nobody read to him. Nobody sat with him at the end. I've thought about that a lot." George was quiet. Outside, a car moved slowly along the street below, its headlights sweeping across the wet pavement. "I'm George," he said finally. "I know who you are," Morgan said, and there was a warm current of amusement in his voice. "I've known since the moment I saw you standing there, I'm Morgan. I know who you are too." They stood side by side for a moment. Two famous men in an empty corridor at 2 in the morning. And the absurdity of it was not lost on either of them. But it wasn't uncomfortable. It had the quality, instead, of something quietly inevitable, as though the hospital had arranged it. "What brings you here?" Morgan asked. "If you don't mind." "Heart stuff. Stress, they think." George kept his voice level. "I've got a tour going. The doctor wants me under observation tonight." He looked down at his hands resting on the windowsill. "I keep telling myself I'm fine." "And do you believe yourself?" George considered that seriously. "Not entirely." Morgan nodded. He didn't offer reassurance, and George was grateful for that. There was nothing worse than being told everything was going to be fine by someone who had no way of knowing. They were quiet for a moment, listening to the hospital breathe, the distant soft chime of a monitor, the shuffle of shoes somewhere down another hall, the particular compressed silence of a building full of people trying to hold themselves together. "Can I ask you something?" George said. "Go ahead." 6 years of coming to hospitals at night, reading to dying people. What do you get out of it? Not in a selfish way. I just mean, what does it give you? Morgan took a moment before answering. And when he did, his voice had dropped slightly, like something he was saying more to himself than to George. Perspective, mostly. There's a thing that happens to men like us, people who've spent their lives in front of crowds. You start to believe, on some level, that the attention is the meaning, that being seen is the same as mattering. He turned to look at George. "Coming here reminds me that there are people who do the most important work in the world in complete invisibility. No applause, no cameras, no legacy documentaries." He glanced down the corridor. "The nurses on this floor tonight will work 8 more hours after midnight. They will hold the hands of people who are terrified. They will clean and medicate and make decisions in seconds that determine whether someone lives or dies. And most of them will go home tomorrow morning. And nobody, not a single person outside this building, will know their names." George felt something shift inside him. Not dramatically. Not the way songs described revelations, all at once and blinding. It was more like a door opening slowly on a room he hadn't known was there. "The artists fill the arenas," Morgan continued, "but it's the nurses who stay when the lights go out." George said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "I want to meet them." Morgan looked at him. "The nurses on this floor tonight. I want to talk to them." George straightened up from the window. He wasn't entirely sure where the impulse was coming from, only that it felt more necessary than anything he'd done in months. Not as George Strait, the singer, just as a man who's awake at 2 in the morning and would like to know their names. Morgan studied him for a moment with those calm, assessing eyes. Then something in his expression softened. Not quite a smile, but the thing that lives just behind one. "Then let's go find them," he said. The nurses' station on the 3rd floor was a wide semicircular desk cluttered with charts, monitors, coffee cups, and the organized chaos that characterized every hospital night shift in America. 3 people were working it when George and Morgan approached, a woman in her late 30s with dark hair pulled back severely, and the focused expression of someone managing 4 simultaneous crises. A younger man in blue scrubs who was typing rapidly into a computer terminal, and an older woman seated slightly apart, filling out paper forms with the methodical patience of someone who had long since stopped expecting the work to end. The woman with the dark hair looked up first. She had quick, intelligent eyes, the kind that assessed a situation in under a second and moved on. Her name tag read, Diane Callaway, RN. "Mr. Strait," she said, and her voice carried no particular excitement. Only the calm efficiency of someone who had seen a great many things on night shifts and had learned to receive all of them with equal steadiness. "Is everything all right? Do you need something?" "I'm fine," George said. I couldn't sleep. And I got to talking with my friend here, and I wanted to come introduce myself properly." He paused. "I realized I checked in this evening, and I haven't said a real hello to anyone who actually works here." Diane Callaway looked at him for a moment, then at Morgan Freeman standing beside him, then back at George. Something in her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not softened, exactly, but recalibrated. "That's unusual," she said. "I'm sure it is," George agreed. The younger man at the computer terminal had stopped typing. He was perhaps 26, with an open, earnest face and the look of someone still young enough to be surprised by things. His tag read, "Joel Harrington, RN." "You're really George Strait," Joel said. It wasn't quite a question. "I really am," George said. "And you're Joel Harrington." Joel blinked. "You read my tag." "I did." George extended his hand. "Nice to meet you, Joel." The older woman at the far end of the desk had set down her pen. She was perhaps 60, with silver-streaked hair and the kind of face that had earned every one of its lines. Her name tag read, "Carol Whitfield, RN." She was looking at George with an expression he couldn't immediately read. Something between wariness and something older and more complicated. "Mrs. Whitfield," George said, turning to her, "how long have you been a nurse?" Carol Whitfield looked at him steadily. 34 years, she said. The number landed in the air between them like a stone dropped into still water. 34 years, George repeated quietly. "My feet know every floor of this hospital," she said. And there was no complaint in it, only fact, delivered with the matter-of-fact dignity of someone who had never needed anyone to tell them their work mattered, because they had always known it themselves. George nodded slowly. He looked around the station, at the monitors, the charts, the cold coffee, the particular quality of artificial light that had no relationship to time of day, the whole machinery of care running quietly through the dark hours while the city slept. "I have a concert in Austin in 4 days," he said. "There'll be 40,000 people there. They'll sing every word back to me. They'll cheer and wave, and it'll be something. I know that." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But I want you to know that standing here right now, in this hallway, feels like something too. Maybe something more." Diane Callaway was watching him with those quick, assessing eyes. After a moment, she said, "There's a break room down the hall. It's not much, but there's decent coffee and a microwave that works on the second try. If you two want to sit a while, I can spare Joel for 20 minutes. Carol's about to take her break anyway." Morgan Freeman, who had been standing quietly to one side, spoke for the first time since they'd approached the station. "We'd like that very much," he said. And so it began. The night that none of them had planned, that none of them could have predicted. Moving forward on its own quiet momentum through the dark hours of a San Antonio February, carrying each of them towards something they didn't yet have a name for. The break room was exactly as Diane had described it. Not much, but functional. A rectangular table with mismatched chairs, a counter with a drip coffee maker that was perpetually warm, a microwave with a faded instruction note taped to it that read, "Press start twice," a whiteboard on one wall covered in shift schedules, and a hand-drawn birthday message for someone named Pete. A single window looked out onto a parking structure, its concrete levels stacked in the sodium vapor dark. Joel Harrington poured coffee with the automatic efficiency of someone who had done it thousands of times and sat across from George, turning the cup slowly in his hands. He had the nervous energy of a young man who wasn't sure how to occupy his body in an unusual situation. Morgan sat at the end of the table, unhurried, his O'Connor book set to one side, listening with the quality of attention that seemed to be his natural mode of being in the world. "You from San Antonio originally?" George asked. "No, sir. Beaumont, about 4 hours east." Joel looked up. "You know Beaumont?" "I know it. Southeast Texas. Oil country." "That's it." Something passed across Joel's face. "My dad worked the refineries for 22 years. My grandfather before him." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "There wasn't really a question, growing up, about what you did. You went into the plants, or you went into the military, or you left. Most people stayed. But you left." "I left." Joel said it without apology. But there was something underneath the words. Something that had been sitting there a long time. "My mom was sick when I was a teenager. Nothing terminal. Rheumatoid arthritis, bad enough that there were weeks she couldn't get out of bed. I used to drive her to appointments at the medical center in Beaumont, and I'd watch the nurses with her. The way they talked to her like she was a person, not just a chart. The way they remembered things she'd told them the week before." He paused. "My dad thought nursing was women's work. He didn't say it in those exact words, but he didn't have to. Beaumont in the early 2000s, you understood the subtext." "How'd you handle that?" George asked. Joel smiled slightly, the smile of someone who had processed this particular conflict a long time ago and arrived somewhere on the other side of it. "I handled it by waiting until I was 18 and applying to UT Health in Houston without telling him until after I'd been accepted." He glanced up. "He didn't speak to me for about 4 months. And now?" Joel was quiet for a moment. "He came around, mostly. He never completely said he was proud of me. That's not how he's built. But he stopped being actively against it. And for my dad, that's about as close to a blessing as you get." He took a drink of coffee. "He had a stroke 2 years ago. I was the one who managed his care, coordinated with the doctors, explained everything to my mom and my sister. I knew exactly what questions to ask, and when to push back, and when to trust the process." His voice was even, but something in his eyes was not. "He didn't say thank you, but when they discharged him, he gripped my arm at the door of the hospital, just held it for a second. And that was it. That was everything." The room was quiet. The fluorescent light above them buzzed almost inaudibly. "There's a patient on this floor," Joel said after a moment, his voice shifting, lower, more careful. "Room 309. Her name is Beverly Hartwell. She's 52 years old. Breast cancer, advanced. She has a daughter who's 11, and the daughter lives with the father. And they've been divorced for 6 years, and it's complicated." He set down his cup. "Beverly doesn't sleep much. I've been checking on her every hour on my shifts for the last 2 weeks. We talk sometimes when she's awake and wants to. She told me once that the thing she's most afraid of isn't dying. It's that her daughter will grow up and remember her as the sick version. The hospital version." His jaw tightened slightly. "She showed me a picture on her phone of the two of them at SeaWorld in San Diego, maybe 3 years ago. Beverly has this huge smile, and her hair is long and she's tan and healthy looking. And she keeps that picture in a folder she calls, 'Remember Me Like This.'" George felt the words land somewhere deep and undefended. "I think about her a lot," Joel continued. "On my drive home, in the shower, falling asleep. You're not supposed to take it home with you. That's what they tell you in school. That's what the supervisors say. Build healthy distance. Maintain professional detachment." He looked up at George directly. "But how do you do that? How do you sit with someone through the hardest thing a human being can go through, and then just turn it off when you clock out?" George looked at him for a long moment. He thought about the thousands of nights he'd stood in the wings of a stage, listening to the crowd noise building, feeling the adrenaline come up through his boots from the floor. He thought about the nights he'd driven home after a concert and sat in his truck in the dark driveway of his ranch, unable to move for 20 minutes, still carrying something he couldn't put a name to. "You don't turn it off," George said. "I don't think the people who really care ever do. I think you learn to carry it differently. You find places to set it down for a while, and places where it needs to stay with you. But turning it off completely," he shook his head. "I think the day you manage that is the day you become less useful to the people who need you." Joel looked at him, really looked at him, in the way young people rarely looked at older men who were famous, seeing past the familiarity of the face to the person behind it. "How do you know when you're about to break?" Joel asked. He seemed surprised by his own question, as though he hadn't known it was there until it came out. George thought about the cardiologist, about the word likely, about the chest tightening during sound check in Dallas 3 weeks ago, and again in Oklahoma City, and again last night in San Antonio. "Your body tells you," George said quietly, "if you're listening." Morgan, who had been silent through all of this, spoke then. He said, "The problem is that people who care most are also usually the worst at listening to their own bodies, because the caring becomes the whole thing. The work becomes the reason for everything. And to stop, even to slow down, feels like a kind of abandonment." Joel looked at Morgan. "Yeah," he said. Just that one word, but with the full weight of recognition behind it. "You're not abandoning Beverly Hartwell by sleeping," Morgan said. "You're ensuring that when you walk back into room 309 tomorrow, you're actually there, actually present. The version of yourself that showed up hollow and exhausted isn't what she needs." Joel was quiet for a long time. Outside the window, the parking structure held its concrete silence. Somewhere in the building, a phone rang twice and stopped. "I applied for a travel nursing position in Portland," Joel said finally. "About a month ago. I haven't told anyone here." He looked at his coffee cup. "The pay is better. It would help with my loans, but mostly He stopped. "I don't know if I'm running towards something or away from it." "Could be both," George said. "Doesn't that make it wrong?" "Doesn't make it wrong," George said. "Makes it human." Joel absorbed that. He looked like a man setting something down that had been heavy for a long time, not discarding it, just resting it on the table for a moment while he caught his breath. The break room door opened and Diane Callaway leaned in. "Joel, Mr. Ramirez in 307 needs you." He's agitated again. Joel was on his feet before she'd finished the sentence. The transition instant and complete. The young man with his doubts and his Portland application vanishing behind the nurse, who knew exactly what to do. He looked back at George once from the doorway. "Thank you," he said. It was simple and genuine, and carried no performance in it. Then he was gone, and the door swung shut, and the break room was quiet again. George stared at the table for a moment. He thought about Beverly Hartwell in room 309, awake in the dark with a folder on her phone called "Remember Me Like This." He thought about 40,000 people in Austin singing his words back to him next week, and he thought about how strange it was that this fluorescent-lit room, this cooling coffee, this conversation with a 26-year-old nurse from Beaumont who was afraid of his own compassion, felt more real than any of that. "She asked him something worth asking," Morgan said quietly. George looked up. "Who?" "Diane," when she leaned in. Morgan paused. "She said he's agitated again. Not the patient in 307. She knows his name." He met George's eyes. In a hospital this size, on a 12-hour night shift with 30 patients on the floor, she knows his name. George said nothing. He didn't need to. Carol Whitfield took her break at 3:15. She came into the break room with the deliberate, unhurried movement of someone who had earned every step, poured herself a cup of coffee without looking at the pot, and sat down across from George and Morgan with the composure of a woman who had seen enough in 34 years that two famous faces in the hospital break room barely registered as remarkable. She was a big woman, not heavy, but solid, with the kind of physical presence that suggested reliability, that made you think of load-bearing walls. Her hands around her coffee cup were strong and slightly rough, the hands of someone for whom work had always been physical. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled back in a way that suggested it had been pulled back in exactly that way for decades. "I have 19 minutes," she said pleasantly. Not rudely, just factually. "Then we won't waste them," George said. She looked at him steadily. Then she said, "You want to know about the 34 years. If you want to talk about them." Carol was quiet for a moment, turning her cup. "I started here in 1991. I was 26 years old. Ronald Reagan had just left office. This hospital had linoleum floors in a different color, and the nurses' station was on the other side of the building." She paused. "I've seen them remodel this floor 3 times. I've watched them take out walls and put in walls. I've watched the technology change so completely that half the equipment we use today didn't exist when I started." She took a sip of coffee. "But the patients haven't changed. Scared in the same ways, needing the same things. Someone to see them, someone to stay." "Did you always want to be a nurse?" Morgan asked. Carol gave a short, dry sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "I wanted to be a lawyer. I wanted it badly. I got into Texas A&M on an academic scholarship. I was going to go to law school after." She paused. "My mother had a massive stroke when I was 22. She was partially paralyzed on the left side. She needed around-the-clock care that my family couldn't afford to pay for. And my father had his own problems." Her voice remained level, but something in it became denser. "So I switched to nursing. It was practical. It was a good income. And I could take care of my mother while building a career." "What happened to law?" George asked. "I put it away," Carol said simply. Not bitterly, just away, into a drawer. "And then the years moved faster than I expected. And at some point, I stopped keeping track of the drawer." She set down her cup. "My mother lived for 14 more years after the stroke. She died in this hospital, on the 2nd floor, in 2003. I was working a shift 2 floors up when she passed." She said this without drama, without apparent self-pity. "One of the nurses downstairs came up and told me. I went down and sat with her for a few minutes. And then I came back up here and finished my shift. The room was very quiet." "That's extraordinary," Morgan said. "It's what you do," Carol said. "The patients don't stop needing care because you're grieving. You find the place inside yourself where you're still functional, and you work from there." She paused. "My husband, Robert, used to say that nurses don't break down. They just run on a different frequency when things are hard." He said it affectionately. Her voice changed almost imperceptibly on the past tense. "He died in 2019. Heart attack. He was in this hospital too. Different floor. I wasn't working that night, at least." George was watching her carefully. The steadiness of her, the way she delivered these facts without performing stoicism, because she wasn't performing anything. The stoicism was structural. It was what she was built of. "Do you have kids?" he asked. "2 daughters, Laura Whitfield in Phoenix, she teaches middle school, and Renee Whitfield in Houston. She's an engineer." Carol's expression shifted then. Just slightly. Just enough to let something warmer in. "Neither of them became nurses. I didn't push them toward it, and I didn't push them away from it. I just told them to do whatever they couldn't imagine not doing." She paused. "Laura called me 2 nights ago. She's pregnant with her first. My first grandchild." The warmth spread a little further across her face before she gathered it back in. "I'm going to Phoenix for a week in April." "That's wonderful," George said, and he meant it fully. "It is," Carol agreed. There was a beat of silence, and then Carol said, in a different tone, not cooler, but more direct, "Can I ask you something, Mr. Strait?" "Please. You've been in music for 40 years. You've had your share of loss and hard things, I'd imagine. How do you make peace with the parts of your life that didn't go the way you'd hoped?" The question was unexpected, and George felt it the way you feel an unexpected step down in the dark, a sudden recalibration of balance. He thought about it honestly, without reaching for the comfortable answer. "I'm not sure I've always made peace with it," he said. "I've had things, losses, mistakes, years that I wish I'd done differently, things I can't undo." He paused. "I think what I've learned is that peace isn't really a destination. It's more like a practice, something you choose over and over, every time the other option shows up." He looked at her. "You seem like someone who understands that." 34 years of choosing," Carol said. "Every shift." "Does it ever feel like too much?" Morgan asked gently. Carol considered the question with the serious attention it deserved. "There was one year, 2009, when it did. I was handling 60-hour weeks because we were short-staffed, and there was a stretch of about 3 months when we lost 7 patients in 2 weeks, and one of them was a child. And I came home one night and sat in my car in the driveway and didn't go inside for 2 hours." She paused. "Robert came out eventually. He didn't say anything. He just sat in the passenger seat and stayed there until I was ready." She was quiet. "That was the closest I ever came to not going back, to calling in the next day and the day after, and eventually just not going back." "What made you go back?" George asked. Carol looked at her hands for a moment. "The day I stayed home, a nurse from the day shift called me to check in. Her name was Patricia Owens. She retired 6 years ago. She didn't know anything about the 2 hours in the car or the 7 patients or any of it. She just called to share a story about a patient who'd been discharged that morning after a long recovery. A man who'd come in barely conscious 3 weeks before, and who walked out on his own 2 feet that morning and stopped at the nurse's station and said—" Carol paused, something moving in her expression. He said, "I want to thank the night shift. I know they were there even when I couldn't see them. Tell them I know." George felt something tighten in his throat. "Tell them I know," Carol repeated quietly. "I went back the next day." Morgan Freeman was looking at her with an expression of such quiet and undemonstrative respect that it required no words. "Patricia called you at the right moment," George said. "People often do," Carol said. "If you've been paying attention to them long enough, the world has a way of sending the right thing at the right time." She picked up her coffee cup, found it empty, set it down. "I don't believe in miracles, but I believe in timing, and I believe in people who pick up the phone." Her pager went off, a soft double beep that she glanced at with the immediate readiness of someone who had been answering pages for 34 years. She stood, smoothing her scrubs. "My 19 minutes," she said. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitfield," George said. She paused at the door, and she looked back at him with those steady eyes that had seen the full spectrum of what human beings were capable of, the worst and the best and everything in between. "George," she said, using his first name for the first time, naturally, without affectation. "You're a good man to be doing this tonight. A lot of people would have stayed in their room." She paused. "Come back sometime. Not as a patient." Then she was gone, and the door swung shut. and the break room held only the hum of the fluorescent light, and the smell of coffee, and the particular quality of silence that follows after something genuine has been said. At 4 in the morning, the third floor settled into its deepest quiet. The urgencies of early night had passed through their cycles. The slower, heavier hours before dawn had taken hold. George walked the corridor again, this time alone. Morgan had gone back to check on Walter Kowalski in room 318. Sitting with him through the small hours, the O'Connor book open in his lap, reading in a low voice to a man who might or might not have been conscious enough to hear. George stopped outside room 309. The door was slightly ajar, and a pale band of light fell across the corridor floor. He stood there for a moment, not quite sure what he was doing. What compulsion had brought him here instead of back to his own room? A voice came from inside, quiet and strained. "Is someone there?" He pushed the door gently open. Beverly Hartwell was awake in the bed, propped against pillows, her face turned toward the door. She was thin. More than thin, reduced by illness to something essential. The architecture of her face prominent and sharp, but her eyes were alert, and her expression, when she registered who was standing in her doorway, moved through a fast succession of emotions that settled, surprisingly, on humor. "Well," she said, "that's unexpected." "I'm sorry to disturb you," George said. "I was just walking." "So was I," she said, with a slight gesture indicating that walking, for her, had become a metaphorical activity. "In here." She touched her temple. He hesitated. "May I come in for a minute?" "I'm not going anywhere," she said. He sat in the chair beside her bed, the visitor's chair that had become, in hospitals everywhere, a symbol of waiting and vigil. Beverly Hartwell looked at him with the directness that the seriously ill sometimes acquired, as though illness had burned away all the social performance and left only the essential person. "Joel told me a musician was visiting tonight," she said. "He didn't say who. He was being professionally discreet." A pause. "He's a good kid?" "He is," George agreed. "He talks to me sometimes. Mostly I just need someone to be in the room. The hospital at 4 in the morning has a particular quality. Like the whole world has gone somewhere without you." She looked at the dark window. "I don't sleep much." "Me neither tonight. Why are you here, if you don't mind?" "Heart monitoring, stress, they think." Beverly looked at him with a thin smile. "I don't mean the hospital. I mean in my room. In this chair." George looked at her directly. "Joel told me about the folder. Remember me like this?" Something moved across her face. Not pain, exactly, but the full recognition of being seen, which was its own kind of pain and its own kind of comfort simultaneously. "He shouldn't have told you that," she said, but her voice was not angry. "No," George agreed. "Probably not, but I'm glad he did." Silence. Outside the window, the city was dark and still. A siren moved somewhere in the distance, receding. "She's 11, Beverly said. "Chloe. Her father has her, which is—" She paused. "He's a decent man. He'll take care of her." "That's not what I—" She stopped again. "The thing nobody tells you about this kind of illness is that the fear shifts. At first you're afraid of dying. Then you make a kind of adjustment, and the dying itself isn't the fear anymore. The fear becomes—" She looked at her hands on the blanket. "What they'll remember. How they'll remember. Whether it'll be enough." George said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would improve on the silence. "I was a graphic designer," Beverly continued. "I had my own small studio. I did branding work, logos, packaging. I was good at it. I loved it." Her voice carried something that was almost wonder at the distance between that person and this one. "I used to take Chloe to the studio on Saturdays, sometimes when her dad was traveling. She'd sit at the extra desk and draw, and I'd work. and we'd listen to music. I had this whole playlist for Saturdays. Patsy Cline, Dolly Parton, Emmylou Harris. She paused. A lot of your songs. George felt the words like a hand placed on his shoulder. She knows all the words to The Chair, Beverly said, and her voice broke slightly on it, the first crack in the composure she'd been maintaining. She's 11, and she knows all the words to The Chair because she heard it 100 Saturday mornings in my studio. George cleared his throat. He thought about the song. A simple thing, a conversation starter, a twist of luck and missed connection, and about how songs went out into the world and became something completely different in other people's lives. How they became Saturday mornings and studios and fathers traveling and daughters drawing and mothers who were still themselves, still whole, still capable of loving their work and their children with equal intensity. I could write her a letter, he said, if you'd like. Something she can have. From me. About you. Beverly looked at him. In the pale light of her hospital room, her eyes were very bright. About me? She said. About who you were. Who you are. He paused. Not the hospital version. The studio version. The Saturday morning version. The woman who built a playlist and taught her daughter, Patsy Cline. Beverly Hartwell was quiet for a long moment. Her hands were still on the blanket. You'd do that? She said. Tonight, he said. Before I leave, I'll write it out and give it to Joel to pass on to you, and you can decide what to do with it. She looked away from him, toward the dark window. He could see the effort it was taking her to hold herself together, and he respected it. The particular dignity of someone who had decided, somewhere along the line, that they were not going to be destroyed by what was destroying them. Her name is Chloe Ann Hartwell, Beverly said quietly. She likes purple. She's better at math than I ever was. She wants to be a marine biologist. A pause. She has my mother's laugh. This big, surprised laugh, like laughter is always ambushing her. Something almost like a smile. That's the most beautiful thing about her. Put that in the letter. I will, George said. They sat together for a while after that, not talking, just occupying the same space in the dark, which was its own form of company. At some point, Beverly's eyes closed, and George sat quietly until her breathing deepened and she slept. Then he got up carefully, not making a sound, and stood at the door and looked at her for a moment. This woman who had made a folder called Remember Me Like This and taught her daughter to love country music on Saturday mornings. He went back to his room. He found the notepad on the bedside table, the standard hotel-style notepad that hospitals put out. And he sat at the small desk under the lamp and he wrote. He wrote for 45 minutes. Diane Callaway found him in the corridor at 5:30, leaning against the wall outside the nurse's station, the folded letter in his hand. She had the look of a woman in the middle of a shift that had demanded more than most, but she carried it the way athletes carry exhaustion, functionally, without complaint. Her dark hair had a few more strands out of place than when he'd first seen her. She moved with the same focused efficiency, but there was something beneath it that he'd been noticing since their first exchange. A tightness around her eyes, a quality of withheld feeling that operated just below the professional surface. You're still here, she said, and it was almost amused. I told you, he said. I wanted to know your names. Diane looked at the letter in his hand. Beverly? Joel was right to tell me about her, George said. I hope that's okay. Diane considered for a moment, then said, Beverly asked me, on her first night, if it was possible to request a nurse. I told her we assigned based on schedule. She said, I understand, but whoever you send someone who remembers names. A pause. I sent Joel. You know your people, George said. Diane made a small movement that might have been acknowledgement or deflection. She leaned against the wall beside him, arms crossed. Not closed off, just containing herself. George waited. "I have a situation," she said finally. "I'm saying that completely separately from this conversation. And I'm not asking for anything. But you asked earlier if there was anything you needed to know. And I keep—" She stopped. "Take your time," George said. She looked down the empty corridor. "My brother is a musician. Not your level. Nothing close to your level. He plays in bars and small venues around Austin. He's been doing it for 12 years. He's talented, genuinely talented. But 12 years is a long time to be talented and broke, and living in a one-bedroom apartment and canceling on your nephew's birthday because you had a gig that paid $40. She paused. "He called me last week, and he said he's thinking of quitting, going back to school, becoming I don't know, an accountant, or something else entirely stable and unkillable. And I told him—" She stopped again. "What did you tell him?" George asked. "I told him to quit," she said. Her voice was very level. "I told him that 12 years is enough, that he should build a real life, that music is a beautiful thing but it doesn't pay the rent." She looked at George directly. "And he said, 'I just needed to hear you say it.'" Her jaw tightened. "And since then, I've been, I don't know, wondering whether I said the right thing, whether I told him what was true or what was safe." George was quiet for a moment. He thought about the years before anyone knew his name. The bar gigs, the Beaumont County fairs, the $600 nights that had to cover gas and food and time. He thought about the version of himself who might have heard someone he loved say 12 years is enough, and what it would have done to him. "What's his name?" George asked. Danny Callaway." "Does he play guitar?" "Rhythm guitar, mostly. He writes his own material." A pause. "I have a recording of one of his songs on my phone. He sent it to me a few months ago. I've listened to it about 30 times. She said this like a confession. "Because it's good," George said. She said nothing, but the nothing was an answer. "Diane," George said carefully, "I'm not going to tell you whether you told your brother the right thing or not. I don't know Danny Callaway. I don't know his music. I don't know whether he has the specific combination of talent and stubbornness and timing that it takes." He paused. "But I'll tell you what someone told me in 1973, when I was 21 and broke and playing for 50 people in Corpus Christi. He said, 'The ones who are supposed to quit will quit, and the ones who aren't supposed to quit won't. Your job is just to keep being honest with the ones you love, and let them do the deciding.'" Diane was very still. "Send him the recording," George said. She looked at him. "I told you I was listening to it." "I know. Send it to me, I mean." A beat of silence. "I have a producer friend in Nashville," George said. "He listens to things. I can't promise you anything. I won't promise you anything. But I can promise you that Danny's song will get heard by someone whose job it is to recognize whether there's something there." He looked at her. "It's the least useful and most meaningful thing I can do right now." Diane Callaway stared at him for a long moment. In the shifting light of the early morning corridor, something in her face moved, the tightness around her eyes releasing slowly, like a structure that had been under load finally allowed to settle. "I'll think about it," she said. "That's all I asked," George said. She pushed off the wall and straightened her scrubs, and the professional composure came back into place. Not as a mask, but as what it had always been. A real thing. A genuine and earned thing. Just one of several real things that she carried. She walked back toward the nurse's station, and then she stopped and turned. "Mr. Strait," she said. "George," he said. "George." She paused. "Room 304. Linda Beckett. She's been with us 6 days post-surgery. She's recovering well. She'll be discharged tomorrow. She's 67 years old, and she's from Poteet, Texas. Strawberry country, about 30 miles south of here. She talks about San Antonio in the 50s, when her parents brought her to the Christmas parade on Commerce Street. A pause. She's been awake since 3. She'd like company. George picked up the letter for Beverly, holding it carefully. "I'll stop in," he said. And he did. By 6:15, the hospital had begun its slow, incremental shift from night to day. The quality of sound changed. Footsteps multiplied, carts began moving. Voices appeared in the corridors. The fluorescent light that had been the only light for hours now competed with the first gray-blue suggestion of dawn through the east-facing windows. The night shift had 45 minutes left. George found Morgan in the corridor outside room 318. The older man was standing very still, his back to the door, the O'Connor book closed in both hands. His expression was composed, but carried the weight of something recent. "Walter," George said quietly. Morgan nodded once. "About 20 minutes ago." Peaceful. In his sleep. George stood beside him. They were quiet for a moment in the corridor. "Did he know you were there?" George asked. "I believe so," Morgan said. "He squeezed my hand about an hour ago. That was the last time he was clearly conscious." He paused. "I finished the O'Connor story anyway. A good man is hard to find." It seemed right. George thought about Walter Kowalski, 81 years old, who liked Flannery O'Connor, who had a man in a dark sweater sitting beside him reading aloud through the small hours of a February night, who had not been alone, who had been heard, even at the end. "You gave him a good night," George said. "He gave me one," Morgan replied. They stood there together for a moment longer, in the corridor outside a room where a man had just quietly exited the world. And neither of them spoke, because there was nothing to say that was adequate. And so there was no point in saying anything inadequate. It was Diane Callaway who came to attend to the documentation and the necessary notifications. She moved past them with the careful competence of someone who had walked this particular path before, many times, too many times to count, and who had not become numb to it, but had become capable of it, which was a different thing. She paused at the door and looked back at them. "He was a good patient," she said. "The good ones always go quietly." She went inside, and the door closed softly. At 7 in the morning, George sat in the chair by his hospital room window as the sun came up over San Antonio. The city was coming alive below him. The first traffic moving on the bridges. The river walk catching the early light. A food truck setting up on the corner of a street he couldn't name from here. The February air outside was cold and clear. The sky the pale, washed blue that only existed in the first half hour after sunrise. Doctor. Richard Holloway came in at 7:15, reviewed his overnight monitoring data with the same precise, unhurried manner as before, and told him that his heart was functioning normally, that the episode in Dallas had most likely been stress-induced arrhythmia, and that his recommendation was rest, a reduced touring schedule for the next 4 to 6 weeks, and a conversation with his cardiologist at home. "You're cleared to leave whenever you're ready," Holloway said. "Take it easy today." "I will," George said. After the doctor left, George sat for a while longer. He thought about the night behind him, Joel Harrington and his Portland application, and his father's hand on his arm at the hospital door, Carol Whitfield and her 19 minutes, and the drawer where a law career lived, Beverly Hartwell and a folder called Remember Me Like This, and an 11-year-old who knew all the words to the chair, Diane Callaway and her brother Danny's song that she'd listened to 30 times, Walter Kowalski, who had not been alone, Morgan Freeman, reading O'Connor in a dark hospital room on a Tuesday night because a friend had died alone in Los Angeles 20 years ago. He thought about how the night had begun, with him standing at a window feeling the weight of everything he was responsible for. The concerts, the contracts, the 40,000 people, the management, the relentless machinery of a career that had been running for 4 decades. And how that weight hadn't disappeared. It was still there, but it had been joined by something else, something that recontextualized it, not diminished it, but placed it in relation to other things, other kinds of weight, other kinds of significance. He picked up his phone and called his manager, Brent Fuller, who answered on the third ring with the slightly cautious tone of a man who had learned to read George's calls by the time of day. "Everything okay?" Brent asked. "Everything's fine," George said. "I'm being discharged this morning." A pause. "I need to talk to you about the next 4 weeks." A beat. "The Austin show is in 4 days." "I know. Austin's fine. I mean, after Austin." George looked out at the city in the early light. "I need us to pull back some of the dates. Not cancel, I want to be clear, not cancel. Renegotiate. Push things. Give the band and the crew some room. Give me some room." He paused. "And I need you to call Patrick Dunn in Nashville." "Dunn? What for?" "I'm going to send him a recording. I need him to listen to it seriously and tell me honestly what he thinks." Brent was quiet for a moment in the way of a man absorbing several pieces of unexpected information at once. "Who's recording?" "A guy named Diane Callaway. Plays in Austin. I haven't heard it yet." George paused. "But I will. And I think it's going to be good." He heard Brent absorb this. "Okay," Brent said finally, in the tone of a man who had managed George Strait for long enough to know when the decision was already made. "I'll make the calls." "Thank you, Brent." He hung up and sat for another few minutes. Then he went to the door and walked out into the corridor. The night shift was doing its handover. The day nurses were arriving, the corridors were brightening with increased activity, and the night staff moved through the final motions of their 12 hours with the particular quality of people crossing a finish line they'd been moving toward since midnight. They had the specific exhaustion of those who work against the body's natural rhythms, deep-eyed, slightly slowed, but with something underneath it that George recognized now as a kind of professional pride, too self-contained to announce itself. Joel Harrington was at the nurses' station, completing his chart notes. He looked up when George approached and straightened slightly. George handed him the folded letter. "For Beverly," he said. "She can decide what to do with it." Joel took it with both hands. He looked at it for a moment without speaking, and then he said, "Thank you. I'll make sure she gets it." "Joel." George paused. "Portland." Joel looked up. "Whatever you decide," George said. "Decide it because it's what you need. Not because you think staying makes you more dedicated, and not because you think leaving makes you less so." He met the young man's eyes. "The patients you've already sat with don't stop mattering because you eventually go somewhere else. You carry them. That's how it works." Joel nodded slowly, and something in his face was quieter than it had been at 2 in the morning. Not resolved, but settled, at least for now. Carol Whitfield was gathering her things at the end of the station. She looked up as George passed, and they exchanged a look that required no words. The particular communication of two people who have spoken honestly in a small room at 3 in the morning and have nothing left to prove to each other. "Give my best to Laura," George said, "when you go to Phoenix." Carol smiled. A full, real smile, the kind that reorganized her whole face. "I will," she said. "You take care of that heart." "I intend to." Diane Callaway was at the far end of the corridor, speaking to the incoming day shift charge nurse in the focused, efficient way of someone completing a transition. George waited until she was done, then caught her eye. She walked toward him. "I'm heading out," he said. "How are you feeling?" "Better than I have in months," he said honestly. Diane looked at him with those quick, assessing eyes. She reached into her scrubs pocket and held out her phone. On the screen was a voice memo, a file titled simply, "Danny C." "Halftime." She looked at it for a moment, then at him. "You don't have to listen to it," she said. "I know," he said. She pressed play. The recording was imperfect. A small venue. Crowd noise underneath. The quality of a phone held at a distance. But through all of it came a voice and a guitar. And within the first 8 bars, George felt the thing he always felt in the presence of real music. A kind of internal alignment, as though something had been slightly out of true and had just been corrected. He listened for 90 seconds. Then he looked at Diane. "Send it to me," he said. Diane let out a long, slow breath. She nodded. "I'll call Patrick Dunn today," George said. "I can't promise you what he'll say, but the song is real, and he'll know it." Diane pressed her lips together for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was very steady, but something behind it was not. "He's going to call me this week," she said. "He said he'd call before he made any final decision. About quitting." She paused. "What do I tell him?" George thought about it. "Tell him you listened to his song 30 times, he said. "Tell him you have something he needs to hear. And then let him decide what that means." Diane was quiet. Down the corridor, the hospital moved through its morning transition. The sounds of the coming day washing gradually over the receding night. "Thank you, George," she said. The use of his name again, easy and real. "Thank you," he said, "for everything that happens in this place at 2 in the morning." She held his gaze for a moment, then gave a small, precise nod. The nod of a woman who didn't need gratitude to do her work, but was not too proud to receive it. George picked up his bag from his room, stopped at the front desk to complete his discharge paperwork, and rode the elevator down to the lobby. The automatic doors opened onto the February morning, and the air outside was cold and sharp, and smelled of the city waking up. Exhaust and river water, and bakery from somewhere down the block, and the specific cold pavement smell of a winter morning in San Antonio. Morgan Freeman was standing on the sidewalk, his hands in the pockets of his dark coat, looking out at Commerce Street as the first full light of the sun reached it. "How's your heart?" Morgan asked, without turning. "Fine," George said. "Probably fine." "Better than probably," Morgan said, and there was something in his voice. They stood side by side on the sidewalk, the way they'd stood at the window at 2 in the morning, watching the city come to life in the sharp February sun. A bus moved past. A woman walked a dog. 2 men in hard hats were setting up a construction barrier at the corner. The ordinary machinery of morning. "I'm going to remember this night," George said. "So am I," Morgan said. "Walter Kowalski," George said. "A good man is hard to find," Morgan replied quietly. He laughed, near the beginning of the story, before he fell fully asleep. He laughed at the grandmother arguing with her family in the car. A pause. "I'll think about that laugh for a long time." George nodded. A cab pulled up to the curb without being called. One of those moments of accidental timing that Carol Whitfield would have called something meaningful, and George was beginning to think she might have been right about. "Where are you headed?" Morgan asked. "The hotel first, then Austin in a few days." George picked up his bag. "You?" "Los Angeles tonight. I have a film commitment on Monday." Morgan looked at him. "But I'll be in Nashville in March." "I'll be there too," George said. They shook hands the way men of a certain age and background shook hands, firm and real, and carrying the full weight of meaning, the handshake as a complete sentence. George got into the cab. Through the window, he watched Morgan Freeman stand for a moment on the sidewalk outside Baptist Medical Center. unhurried, looking at nothing in particular and everything in general, before turning and walking back toward the parking structure in the February morning light. The cab moved out into traffic. George looked at his phone. A text from Brent confirming the calls he'd set in motion. A text from his daughter-in-law with a photograph of his granddaughter asleep, sent at some early hour for a completely unrelated reason, arriving now by coincidence or timing or something in between. He looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he looked out the window at San Antonio going about its morning. The people on their way to work, the coffee shops opening, the school buses beginning their routes, the ordinary, magnificent, improbable fact of all these lives being lived simultaneously, most of them in complete invisibility, most of them carrying things no one else could see. The city streamed past the window, and George Strait sat quietly in the back of a cab. And somewhere in the hospital behind him, the night shift ended, and the people who had stayed while the lights were out went home to sleep. The letter George left for Chloe Ann Hartwell was delivered by Joel Harrington to Beverly at 10 o'clock that morning, just after the day shift breakfast rounds. Beverly read it twice, folded it carefully, and placed it in a new folder on her phone. She called it, "For Chloe, from a man who knows." Diane Callaway received a call from Patrick Dunn in Nashville 17 days later. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. Joel Harrington accepted the position in Portland. He gave his notice on a Tuesday. On his last shift, Carol Whitfield brought a store-bought cake to the break room. Nobody made a speech. They ate cake at 3 in the morning between patient checks, and Joel told a story about his first week on the job that made Carol laugh the surprised, ambushed laugh that Beverly Hartwell had once described as the most beautiful thing about her daughter. Carol Whitfield flew to Phoenix in April. She was there when her daughter Laura's son was born. 7 pounds, 4 ounces, healthy and loud. And she held him in the particular way of a woman who had held many people through many things, with the steadiness of someone who had learned, over 34 years, that what hands did mattered more than almost anything else. George Strait played Austin 4 days later. 40,000 people sang every word back to him. He thought about Saturday mornings and Patsy Cline. He thought about a folder called "Remember Me Like This." He played the chair, and when the crowd roared, he stood at the microphone for a moment longer than usual, in the sound of it, letting it be what it was, enormous and beautiful and real, before moving on to the next song.